watching Morning at NTV.
So have you grabbed your copies of the Daily Monitor? Please do. There's quite a lot that you cannot afford to miss out on. But like I said, we're delving into a Kickstarter conversation and the plan by government to enforce a policy to regulate religious organizations to guard against some rogue pastors has set off a combustible contest among faith-based groups. Among the proposals in the draft policy, faith-based outfits are expected to register, train their pastors in theological doctrine, and have a cordial relationship with government. Those against the enforcement of this policy are accusing the state of attempting to regulate an inherent right largely within the Pentecostal church. They fear that the creeping hand of the state could be targeted at rising charismatic Pentecostal preachers who have declined to toe the line of an unwritten credo. But first, let's take a look at this particular story just in case you missed out on it.
The plan by government to enforce a policy to regulate religious organizations has set off a combustible contest amongst faith-based groups. Amongst a raft of proposals to be included in the draft policy, faith-based outfits are expected to be registered, train their pastors in theological doctrine, and have a cordial relationship with government. For instance, if cabinet adopts the policy, districts will have religious and faith-based organization boards. They shall be composed of 3 political leaders and 4 technical officers. The committee shall have powers to co-opt technical officers to deal with specific issues. In the view of the state, some pastors, especially in the Pentecostal church, are purveyors of a false gospel and manipulate their flock by faking miracles. And when religion is at its extreme, according to the framers of this policy, it manifests into a potent form of fanatism. Citing Uganda's troubled past, the exponents of this policy claim unregulated religion has offered breeding grounds for cults such as Joseph Kibwetere's, where the leader and his acolytes on March the 17th, 2000, locked believers in a church in Kanungu that was incinerated in a fire, resulting into the death of over 700 people. However, Pastor Michael Chaze of Omega Healing Center says this should be a primary role of intelligence and crime detection.
In every bunch, there are people who are evil, just like there are negative foreign influences within political leaders. That is a work of intelligence and police. And we think they are endowed with laws and they are given tools and they are trained to sniff out any criminals. So I do not think that also warrants a religious policy.
Those against the enforcement of this policy are accusing the state of attempting to regulate the freedom of worship, which is an inherent right. They fear that the creeping hand of the state into regulating religious affairs could be based on the rise of charismatic Pentecostal preachers who have rejected to toe the line of the unwritten credo. For long, the Pentecostal church has been an appendage of the regime. According to critics, in the clientele patronage politics, pliant Pentecostal pastors have offered glowing prophecies in favor of the NRM and its leaders.
Thing is hatched and it is supposed to be applied selectively. Even the whole thing of, requirements of this and that, of, theological training and all that, I can assure you that nobody is going to be taken out of practice for not having a theological diploma or degree if they toe the government line. This is all politics.
The Pentecostal church's clout extends to the seat of power, that some of its leaders influence job appointments and others are given coveted roles in government. In the last population census carried out in 2014, the Pentecostal Church registered the biggest growth between the years of 2002 to 2014. For instance, between 2002 to 2014, the numbers of the Catholic Church, which is the largest denomination, fell from 41.6% to 39.3%. The Anglican Church, The second largest church registered a decline from 36.7% to 32%, while the Muslim faith grew slightly from 12.4% to 13.7%. Some of the Pentecostal pastors offer a different message from the traditional church that usually sticks to doctrinal theory. There fears that with the rise of emboldened pastors who preach a message of fire and brimstone at the pulpit, the state might gradually begin to lose a firm grip on the Pentecostal church. Pentecostal churches have previously been registered under the Trustees Incorporation Act and supervised by the Internal Affairs and Justice Ministries. However, the National NGO Policy of 2010 has recommended that faith-based organizations, which until now have been obliged to register as NGOs, shall not fall under the ambit of the NGO policy. Many of these faith-based outfits, which were registered under the NGO Act prior to the establishment of the policy, have been deregistered recently. If the policy is adopted, churches will be placed under the docket of the Ethics Ministry. The leading exponent of this campaign, a former Catholic priest and ethics minister, Father Simon Cotto, says the policy will largely target churches that are keen on manipulating their flock.
Extortion, exploitation, demand, and all those things put together. And then bad guidance, where I'm told some of my pastors tell to their faithful, go and sell everything you have and come, God will bless you. They even go and encourage separation of families. These are very unacceptable things. They tell people not to go to receive scientific treatment for their sicknesses because they say God will do everything.
He also emphasized the need of theological training.
So for purposes of proper church organization and management, we need to be trained. That does not negate the fact that people are called by God, it's true, but there is needed to be well organized and do things that are pertinent, that meet the needs of the people, the community to which God calls us to go, as preachers, as pastors, whichever title one would like to choose.
To learn, right? You cannot go and become a teacher, jumping out from nowhere, and you start going to do the course of teaching. You first of all must have the elementary. You do your primary, which gives you the basis. You give the secondary, which gives you some apprehension capacity, and then you go for your expertise. In Europe, the minimum is 7 years of education in the basic. Then you go for your branch, career making. That's what we want.
Because there are some who believe that they need to be directly linked with God. Religious organizations, which are African religious organizations, they rely on oral tradition. They rely on direct spiritual contact. They do not run schools. They don't have universities. How is he going to train those? If the document is segregative and it is targeting a certain religious group, say Pentecostals, then they are talking about the Pentecostal doctrine. We believe that the calling comes first, then the training later. Whoever Jesus worked with, he first called them to be with him, then he trained them. And most of them, St. Peter, St. Paul, were trained on the job.
The draft policy also recognizes self-regulation. The Director of Religious Affairs in the Ethics Ministry, Reverend Aaron Mwesige, told NTV that the policy is not meant to enforce a harsh regulation and police faith-based organizations, but will largely set guidelines for effective operation.
A day policy, in other words, it's not the Directorate for Ethics and Integrity policy. It is not a government policy. It is the religious and faith-based organizations policy. Government is only playing a part of facilitation. We are facilitating the development of a plan. You know, a policy is our plan that will put what the minister called standard or the guidelines. I think that's the right word. Actually, policy sets guidelines that will set guidelines for effective operation. Let me give you an example. If you want to start a church under Pentecostal, or you want to start a mosque under Muslims, What should be the parameters? What should be the ABC on ground?
Pastor Michael Chaze accuses the government of intruding on the space of freedom of worship to validate and control faith-based outfits. He cited the areas of concern in the proposed policy, which he argues requires compliance to the whims and fancies of the regime.
In our bad eye view, what we see is we see government trying to become the supervisor and overseer of religious faiths. We are seeing government mixing politics with religion.
The passion from religion any more than you can remove it from sport, then what's the point? So are people supposed to go to a stadium dressed in ties and what, and clap their hands like that? So religion without fanatism is dead. You have to be passionate. You have to be a fanatic, believe those things strongly, and not everybody is going to go down that path. Some people actually despise it. But then you cannot say that people should not go down that path, because that is what it is all about.
The intention of the law really is to push the born-agains to be under a sort of a structure setup, which is termed as the RFO board under that proposed law, which will really constitute of a couple of political leaders like the RDC, DISO. You'll have I think the person from you'll have the DISO, RDC, you'll have somebody from the president's office, and a few representatives of the born-again faith. So it intends to push the born-agains into some sort of structurally existent framework which is recognized by law, and as such they can then be muzzled by the government.
Joseph Kabuleta, who is a pastor with the Watchman Ministries, has already tested the wrath of the state. Earlier on in August this year, he was detained on charges of offensive communication under Section 25 of the Computer Misuse Act. He regained his freedom 4 days after his arrest. Beyond the narrow traditional space, which often recedes at the whims and fancies of the regime, cyberspace has handed a potent weapon to those with a craft to take on the state on subjects deemed uncomfortable to debate in the public. That is what Kabuleta, a former sports journalist, exploited. He believes that the policy will be selectively enforced to muzzle critical voices.
Now, why is it of consequence now as we are heading into an election? Everybody knows that. So as long as people do not let themselves be deceived by the marketing of this heinous law, that it's to curb excesses, people are being taken advantage of and all that, and they actually go to the nitty-gritty of it and look at what the draft policy says, only then can they make sober judgment. But the thing is, so many people are looking at what they are being fed, and they are being fed a completely different story from what is being propagated here by the people pushing for the policy.
Do you believe, in your view, Simon Senyonga says the policy is a choreographed ploy to bring certain sections of faith-based organizations on their knees. He cited a recent incident where the Criminal Intelligence and Investigations Directorate accused Prophet Elvis Mbonye for decampaigning immunization, which Senyonga says was a trumped-up charge.
The fear for the supernatural is actually much more for the people who are in the government, because they can't explain it. Because if you're just going to do the usual thing of singing mass and celebrating mass, it's somehow well known, it's well crafted. But where something is not conventional and you cannot calculate what will be the impact or the collateral damage that it would cause in case it's allowed to exist, then the best thing you can do is to curtail them or unfairly limit them, and then subsequently derogate the freedom of worship.
Yusuf Serunkuma, a researcher, says the policy could be premised on the fear that some pastors are manipulating their flow.
General concern. So one could argue that the government has registered this concern and now they're responding. There should be a legal framework within which faith-based organizations execute their mandate, execute their freedom. So there should be regulation, and I think that's the spirit. It could be argued that that's the spirit of the bill. Right, so that's part A. There's also need to regulate faith-based organization, right? Because the church the church and the state have often had a sort of a difficult relationship because the church has potential to stand with the people, has potential to mobilize a sizable mass.
Where government thinks that it is the controller of what is good and right, what is good and bad doctrine, or what is correct and incorrect doctrine. Who gives them that responsibility? Faith is a very personal, sacred, sacrosanct thing between a person and what they believe and who they believe in. Now that cannot be policed unless that person breaks an existing law. You cannot police somebody's faith.
One of the key contestations is about the provisions under Chapter 4 of the Constitution in regard to the freedom of worship. Whereas there's a right to freedom of religion, there's a limitation in Article 43 of the Constitution. However, there's also a limitation that provides that any exemption to the rights and freedoms must demonstrably be justified under a free and democratic society. According to the draft policy, it is informed by other laws that are applicable in the work, coordination, and regulation of religious organizations, and they include the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the Anti-Corruption Act, the Marriage Act, and the Public Management Act, as well as other relevant sectoral policies. However, some view this policy as symptomatic of the regime's attempt to curtail freedoms through licensing the media, film, and NGO sectors. The state and the church are strange bedfellows, some will argue. When the church becomes critical of the state, it becomes resentful, and when the church is compliant, usually the ties with the state are cordial. Emmanuel Mutaizibwa, NTV.
All right, that's the story that ran last night, of course, on your screens from here, NTV Uganda. And that will set the base for our conversation this morning on Kickstarter. And to have that conversation, we do have Mr. Simon Senyonga. He is a city lawyer and also one of the members of, yes, is it Zoe Fellowship?
Zoe Fellowship.
Right, courtesy of Prophet Elvis Mbonye, right?
Yes.
Good. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Morning, very good. How's it going? Very well.
It seems like this story will not die
we shall not
until
let it die.
you get what you want.
Yes.
What is wrong with these regulations? Just get down to it.
I think number one, when you read the executive summary of the policy, it identifies isolated cases which should be used as a general example of a broader picture of what's happening in the Pentecostal churches, which is something which is a biased research and as such unfair because it is the basis for them or the foundation for them to actually have this policy. Number two is the structural setup of the policy. It creates an RFO board which has politicians and a few religious leaders to actually, and the politicians have about 80% of that RFO board leadership. Then the procedure and the process of the selection of the people who sit on the board. They are saying that everybody has to be registered under particularly recognized associations of the born-again churches or any other religion. Now, ideally, what that is causing is that there's having a forceful sort of registration, and subsequently, they can have the input of a compulsory theoretical training for everybody, and the failure to do that will mean that they have the capacity to revoke the license that you're having. Then the final part that I can comment about is the sort of the agenda they want to propagate. When you look at the policy, the wording of the policy is that we should be able to cooperate and support the government in fronting the government programs. So meaning that moving forward, every religious institution has to, number one, preach the gospel of the NRM. For example, when you come to church, there must be a slot for the SACCOs, Operation Wealth Creation, and any other government policy. If you don't do that, then you're committing a crime, and as such, you can be arrested, license revoked, and the people, the flocks, can be scattered.
But Senyonga, it looks like this policy is out there to help guard the interests of your followers, not the pastors, because back in the day, 2000, March 17th, Joseph Chibwetere, he incinerated 700 people. These were his followers, people who trusted him. So by government fronting such a policy, they believe they are protecting the followers. Why are you so much against such a goodwill policy?
I think, number one, the Chiwetere incident has been very many years down the road. Number one, there's been no report to actually
But history
explain.
always repeats itself.
Well, that history repeats itself, and it is a danger for us to keep on relying on it as what should inform the contemporary circumstances. The government should have acted earlier to actually have a report and a law crafted then. Number two, you can't use the Chiwetere incident, and as I said, in terms of agenda setting for the politicians, they can always front that, and they can wave it as a carrot for everybody to know that, you know what, this is what happened, all right? And there have been very, very many cases. The thing is that the setup of any religious institution has a self-regulation mechanism. As long as the government intends or the government seeks to come and be supportive of that self-regulation, then ideally it will just infringe on the freedom of worship.
Self-regulation, you're telling government to allow religious organizations to regulate themselves.
Yes, because either way, it's the government which crafted the 1995 Constitution. Article 7 says that there won't be a state religion. What that means is that the government cannot go ahead to sort of come up with a framework which proposes that the government will have a state religion. That's what that policy does. It creates a state religion. Number two, the freedom of worship and expression is a sacrosanct act, meaning that it doesn't need extra support from the government to be properly effected.
Let me ask you, Simon, do you agree that we do have rogue pastors?
Yes, that may be true.
Does it concern you?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so how do we curb against rogue pastors, if at all you're refusing government's attempts to make sure that this place is cleaned up and people like you, you're claiming to be operating okay, people like you are actually safeguarded and that whole tainted image is not affecting you?
I think the best thing for the government to do is actually reinforce the existing laws. You have a plethora of penal laws, you have the Anti-Corruption Act, you have the Anti-Money Laundering Act, you have the NGO Act. Now, what the government has done in the past week actually was to have that compulsory sort of audit process for the NGOs. Because you see now, politically, there's what they call agenda setting. The government is setting an agenda. Number one, they have said under the NGOs, they have scrapped off over 12,000 NGOs. Now they're having a justification to tell the churches that, by the way, look here, we made a cleanup recently, and you guys can no longer fit in the NGO. So what they're doing is that they're pushing out the churches away from the NGO part. But there is already the company law. Most churches are registered as companies. Now, again, they want to push away from the companies because there is sort of an independence in the operation of the company. Now they want to have a direct hand in the operation and determination of everything that happens within the religious bodies. The final thing is this. In terms of agenda setting, again, they're using a media campaign to label this policy as only affecting the born-again churches. But I can assure you this, it may seem that it has come to bite only that, but it's going to affect everybody. Because the intention, the wording of the policy doesn't actually say only the born-again churches. But because we have been the most zealous and we know we are passionate about these issues, we shall come out to fight for those who are probably having divided energies and focusing on other wars probably to fight.
Simon, it seems like the Bible is on the side of government on this one. Timothy, chapter 3, verse 8 to 13. It demands that church leaders must first be tested and allowed to serve only if found fit. That is Timothy. So why are you saying that government is hatching this plan to just rein in and muzzle church leaders right there when the Bible itself right here, it's just calling for leaders to be tested and allowed to serve only if found fit. The Bible.
And you see, when you read the further in those scriptures, Paul goes ahead to set the standard of what actually should be perfect ministry. Number one, there should be the call of God. The call of God is not a call of the government. All right. Number two, there should be a focus on the agenda. What Paul says in the book of Acts, that he was fully apprehended by the heavenly vision and he will not depart. When he was presented before the Sanhedrin Council and he was asked why was he preaching zealously, why was he healing? Always, by the way, the government has tried to muzzle. From the book of Esther in the Bible, since we brought the Bible, in the book of Esther, there was a law that was put to suppress the Jews, who were then what we'd call like the Christians of then. In the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar came up with a law to actually again muzzle the worship of Daniel. And then they said that, you know what, we shall not actually bow down. You know, Daniel and his colleagues, they say, we shall not bow down before Nebuchadnezzar. You go ahead, even the times of Jesus, Herod came up with a law to kill the firstborns. Now, always, the standard, the government, as you said, tries to have a sort of lopsided perspective towards the scripture. Again, and so it's a pick and choose issue. But the broader reading of it is actually to support the church.
It's not a pick and choose, Simon. Also, Mark chapter 10, verse 17 to 25, it says, the rampant self-appointed church owners and leaders who are only satisfying their greed are sinful. Read Jesus' words in Mark chapter 10. What do you make of that?
I think what I make of that is this, that it cannot take away the fact that even the government has also greedy people. Now that does not come. Jesus, who was the author of that actually, did not ever seek government support to clean up what was the mess in the church. At no point in scripture did he ever go to look for, Herod, come and help me, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. Actually, the ones who threw him out of the temple for coming up to challenge existent religious doctrine. And that's what actually is happening right now. That as long as you're going to come up to sort of oppose, because previously the born-again church was filled with many uneducated people, but now you're having young people like me and very many other passionate, educated, and well-informed people who can take on serious intellectual discourse.
Is that what government is afraid of?
Yes, because ahead of 2021, you don't want to have a divided constituency. Because previously the born-again churches or the Pentecostal movement gave a block vote to the government. It has always been, some of the leaders have always been in bed with the government. Now when you're having people who are coming up to say, actually, no, this is the direction of the Lord, not that. Because the church has been handed over by very many people, very many leaders. Like previously what you saw at the Lugogo, where Museveni met a few pastors, and they were not talking about the policy. They were all pleading with him. He literally became their God. He says, Mr. Museveni, help us. You're our father. You're all our all in all. They no longer have a God to call upon. They only have the president and his people to call upon.
So what you're saying is that they've been compromised, so to speak.
Yes, there's been a compromise.
Let's look at this particular draft policy. And of course, clearly you've said that you're against the RFO board because of what it comprises, one, and also what this particular policy is out to do. Muzzle. They are, of course, the religious faith-based organizations. My question would be, instead of refusing the policy in totality, because some of these facets are critical, like training the pastors. He did read out, of course, the verse that says that, hey, someone has to go through that particular process to be deemed fit to lead the flock of Jesus. Now, my question to you would be, if at all this policy is to be edited and we remain with the registration, the training, and of course, making sure that there's no manipulation of the flock, would you still agree with the policy? And we remove the board, we remove all these other facets that seemingly want to turn these churches into PR objects for the government.
Well, the policy, as I said earlier on, is extremely irrelevant. The key things that you would think that should be removed are actually the major constituents of the policy. So a removal of them means that the policy is then removed in total.
Do you think if you're brought to the table to renegotiate the policy, would you sit at it?
If the opportunity was there for us to renegotiate, which the government hasn't actually been open to, because I think the last time I was here, I told you there was a validation exercise we were invited for. There have been about 3 validation exercises. The government will invite you, it will then lock you out, then there will be no clear agenda, then there will be no reports from the previous meetings. So already the spirit of the law is actually a violation of the government policy guidelines of 2013, which are a reference document to inform all public institutions and line ministries when they're making up policies. So number one, the space of negotiation has already been closed out. Number two, even if negotiation was there, we have very strong opposition towards it. As we have earlier on, we have done due diligence. We have sent in petitions to the Ministry of Ethics and Integrity, and those petitions have not been responded to. Number one, we have taken on media activism, and even the media activism, they have come out actually to use the media to actually blackmail those who have come out against the policy. Then there's been intimidation of those who have come out to oppose this policy. Because again, what they want is that the church should not come out to oppose anything. It should simply be in bed with the state. So the question of whether the policy is relevant as well, they can still discuss it or not, cannot suffice.
Simon,
what we're saying is that
the government
no
doesn't really want you, the church leaders, to be in bed with them. The government is so concerned with the fact that many church leaders have veered from the original message of Christ, and now they're talking about the current social injustices in our communities. Is that called the uncharted credo? Yes. So that is their problem right there. Why are so many church leaders veering from the original message of Christ and then you going to talk about these other social injustices? Is it really your place as church leaders?
The government can only be a judge of what they understand.
But is it really your place as church leaders to talk about social
because the
injustices?
church exists in the contemporary world. It shouldn't be church shouldn't be locked up in church. Church should be able to go out to address the people that it is pastoring, that it is pursuing, face the usual challenges that are actually imposed by the government. Because if the government is stealing money for the healthcare, for example, giving wrong vaccination, like what it did, and you've seen the side effects, then the church should be able to demonstrate the power of God through healing. If the government is having officials who are stealing money and are corrupt, then the church should be able to have an alternative position by showing a supernatural prosperity.
You say that churches should be able to talk about the problems affecting people, like drugs that are given to children and have side effects.
Yes.
We're talking about the immunization campaign.
Yes.
So is this true? And are you telling us right now that Mbonye at some point did tell the flock not to take their children to be immunized because they might have side effects, like you've mentioned?
Well, that is not true. He did not actually do that. I think what is very clear is that he gave a prophecy in 2018 that showed that actually there was going to be a wrong campaign, and that was the hepatitis B campaign, which went actually wrong, and the government came out to even arrest officials and even go on record and said what we did was wrong to some extent. Now, he never came out to say that don't immunize. Number one, medicine itself has no problem. I think what we preach from where I come from, it is that you can exercise your faith. All right, from glory to glory, from level to level.
All right.
We don't say don't take medicine and all that.
Simon, let me ask you a final question as we wrap this up. Is there an end in sight?
Is there
an end in sight?
an
End in sight. Government is not backing down on this. They will still push for it. On this other side, you guys are still strong on your ground. So do we have an end in sight?
Yes, I think the end in sight is that the church is going to come out victorious and religion is not going to be tampered with. What will happen is this. I think the agenda has already been set. There's a precedent in the scriptures that anybody who comes out against the church will never remain standing. And the end of this government can be marked by the beginning of a war against the body of Christ.
That right there is the reason why government is so hard on you guys. Those fellowships, those what are they called, Malad, where you try to foresee the future, and then look, Mbonye himself was trying to pit Museveni, saying that he might lose the 2021 general election.
He never said that.
He did mention it at some point, that some doom is coming for this government.
If he doesn't stop being in bed with religious leaders who are oppressing the church.
Now you see, you're holding the government hostage, that if they don't do this, this might happen.
Because we have the power to.
That's why they need this law.
We have the power
and
to,
you
and
agree.
we don't have the power to.
And you agree that's why they need this law.
No, we have the authority. We know, let me tell you something. The church is the most supreme authority beyond any state or government. Christ is the head of everything, not the government.
Simon Senyonga is a lawyer and a member of Zoe Ministries. This conversation could go on and on and on. Crooks and original pastors. I called Mbonye Mr. Yes, and he went so hard on me for calling Mbonye the Mr. and not the prophet. So that made me believe that maybe some people are worshipping these prophets
and not God.
And not God.
All right, that's it for a Kickstarter conversation. All right, okay. All right, hashtag Morning at NTV. What are your thoughts on this one? Fanatism and religion and us worshipping the pastors and not God. How this space can be regulated just to make sure that we guard against the rogue pastors. Hashtag Morning at NTV. Let's take that short commercial break. We'll be back with our Take Note conversation.